Okay, we're going to welcome you out to the next installment of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today we're going to discuss the recent lecture or talk given by Patrick Mason at the 2016 FairMormon Conference, and we've got a couple of commenters that are going to help us with the review and commentary on that talk. We'll start out with you, Alison. We have Alison Udall. If you want to just take a brief second and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Alison Udall, and I'm in Bozeman, Montana. I was born and raised in the church and got married when I was 19 in the Mesa Temple in 1987. Got 4 kids, 3 grandkids. My husband left the church years before I did, and I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out if I could make it as a nuanced, more progressive member. Finally, allowing myself to do research about the church, spent a year basically studying and reading voraciously everything I could get my hands on, and ended up resigning my membership in the fall of 2013. And then a year ago, I developed and created the website Mormon Spectrum, and have helped, which are listed on there throughout the country and the world, for people to connect with each other and find each other. And I'm happy to be on the show.
All right, very good. And then finally we have Paul Toscano.
Hi, Jonathan and Alison. I'm Paul Toscano, and I guess I'm best known for being one of the September 6, that is 6 Mormons who were excommunicated way back in 1993, in September of 1993. Since then, I've written quite a number of books about Mormonism, and that are available on Amazon for anybody who cared to look me up. And I'm interested in Mormon theology, probably more than Mormon history. Been bouncing around the Sunstone circuit for a long time, and I'm happy to be on the show and interested in what Patrick Mason has said, and looking forward to maybe doing a little bit of a commentary on that.
All right, good. And I asked each of you to be here because we'll see that a lot of people came away from Patrick's talk with just an abundance of really positive things to say. And I think, Paul, yours was the first comment that I came across from other people that really pushed back on that a little bit and said, well, actually, there's some difficulties, there's some problems with what he said. And Alison chimed in and resonated with a lot of your main initial comment. And so that's sort of what I wanted to explore as we talk about this. I said I want to start the discussion out just by acknowledging that there are a lot of good things, I think, that he says, and regardless of what our feelings are with the church and whether or not you want it to go away or reform, he points out some things, as we'll see, that I think are going to be important regardless of where you fall on the spectrum. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to let Scott Gordon, the person in charge of FairMormon, introduce him and give him a little bit of background, and then we'll skip to where his comments start. So let's get started.
Okay. We're pleased to have as our next speaker Patrick Mason. Patrick Mason holds the Howard W. Hunter Chair in Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, where he's also an associate professor of religion and chair of the religion department. And there's a lot more in his bio you can read it in here, but we're really pleased to have Patrick here as a speaker. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Patrick Mason.
All right. Now, while I skip forward, if I'm not mistaken, the Howard W. Hunter Chair at Claremont University in the Department of Mormon Studies is the chair that was previously occupied by one Richard Bushman. Does that sound right to you guys?
I wouldn't know.
I don't know that either.
Yeah, I think that is the case. And I've heard some people talk about how, because of some of the things he says, I wouldn't be surprised if, he got a knock on the door from some priesthood brethren looking to chastise him. But given that he's the academic chair in a university, one of the only universities with a Mormon Studies department, a dedicated department within the religion department, I would be surprised if that was the case. I think he's actually in a fairly protected environment where, kind of like with the professor with tenure, where he can say some things without fear of reprisal. So let's go ahead and skip to where his comments start.
So I'll speak for a while and then be happy to field whatever questions or comments you have. So a few months ago, I published a book with Deseret Book and the Maxwell Institute for religious scholarship at BYU called Planted, Belief and Belonging in an Age of Doubt. And it meant to address some of the issues that of course, this group is very familiar with, and the challenges that we face in the church today. And since Planted was published, I've received lots and lots of emails from people who are reconsidering, renegotiating, or otherwise transitioning in their faith or membership in the church, as well as from concerned family members of those who are struggling. So just a quick show of hands. How many of you personally know somebody, a friend, a family member, a ward member, who's not just recently kind of slipped into inactivity, but who has proactively left the church because of historical, doctrinal, or contemporary issues? How many of you know somebody like that? Oh, okay, that's what I expected.
I'm going to pause it right here and just say at the front, a lot of the times in the post-Mormon community, they look at people who are involved in FAIR almost as like the enemy. Almost as like, these are people who are just looking to lie for the church or anything. And I think one of the things that I took out of his question when he acknowledged that there were a lot of people in the audience is that within the paradigm of the worldview that they have, they're really looking to try to help people. They believe that their efforts in trying to answer all these questions are a positive thing in the lives of the people who they're directing their answers to. And so I give them credit for, within their paradigm, trying to do what they believe is right. And I think Patrick's talk goes to that as well.
May I speak?
Yeah, go right ahead.
My question is, why are they doing this? Why aren't the apostles doing this? Why is it that these people in FAIR have to pick up that burden? I don't understand it. I mean, the calling is not to them. The calling to lift up the arms that are fallen and strengthen the feeble knees was given by Jesus Christ to the apostles. And that isn't being done, apparently. So we have, Team B coming in. I have no problem with Team B. I understand that they want to help, but where is Team A?
That's a very good question. Part of me thinks that Team A, the apostles, are in a little bit of a kind of, for some questions, the only answer that makes sense would reveal key problems at the root of Mormonism. And so they can kind of plead a fifth. If they don't provide an answer from the official source, then they don't incriminate themselves. And so in the face of that void, then it's not surprising that some people would stand up and say, well, I can provide some answers. I've got a way of looking at things. And since there are no other answers, then here we go. This is what we can do. Alison, have you had interactions with FAIR people before, for good or bad?
The year that we released Mormon Spectrum website at some time a year ago, I actually had offered to as well go to the FairMormon Conference, and we had a table at Sunstone that year, and we highlighted Mormon Spectrum and released it and opened it for the public. And so I had a little bit of interaction with a few people there to see whether or not that was something that they would be okay with. And that's really my interaction.
Did they allow you to host a table at their conference? No? That's interesting, because to point out, Mormon Spectrum as a resource is not designed only for ex-Mormons. It's designed also to be a place for people that are looking for a more nuanced understanding to find a home. So it would seem like, particularly because they're trying to make the case for that nuance, Mason is anyway, that they would be more open for that. And maybe what we're hearing from Mason is that if you ask that question again next year, you might get a more receptive response. Let's continue.
Yeah, I mean, certainly his talk certainly might indicate that.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
It's more clear to me now than when I wrote the book that there's a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot of very real pain felt by sincere people who are trying to figure all this stuff out. Many of the people I hear from, and I get a lot of emails and occasionally phone calls and things like that, many of the people I've talked to haven't left yet, and they're holding on with their fingertips, trying to find a way to stay in the church with intellectual, spiritual, and emotional integrity. But many others, of course, have left. And no amount of reclamation work is going to bring some of them back, because their feelings are so deep and their paradigms have shifted so profoundly.
I have one comment on that
transitioned
paragraph, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Just this first part of his talk I thought was kind of interesting, some of his choice of wording. And one of the words that, the little phrase that popped out to me on this one was just, he describes it as a lot of confusion out there. And in his previous paragraph, he uses that word slipped into an activity. And so I don't know if you guys noticed a couple of those words, but I'm not sure I would describe people who are going through this as confused. But
well, I think for me, if I take my perspective, and then as I've observed a lot of people, when you're learning all of these things about church history, when you're seeing certain contradictions even within the theology itself, but you're holding on to certain preconceived notions about who Joseph Smith is and the nature of the restoration, then you do feel confusion. That's where you see that cognitive dissonance.
I can see that.
And so as long as you hold on to certain misconceptions as your premises that you're not questioning, and then you're trying to make everything else fit, then I think confusion is a reasonable thing for that. Now, in terms of when he says slipped away, I think that if you get people who are past that point, where they've let go of their preconceived notions about Joseph as a prophet, they've started to accept that maybe the answer to all these questions is that there is no legitimate foundation for all the things that the church is based on, I think then you start to see people who do slip away, because if you talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, they have this thing called fading, where you don't want to cause a big splash, you don't want to be known as the big apostate, and so you just start slipping into inactivity so that you're able to reclaim your life without disrupting family, disrupting job, and other relationships. And so I think that what he's describing is part of the spectrum of how people interact with the church as they start to distance themselves. So that didn't jump out as me. But I can understand how people would be upset by that, because in other FairMormon talks, they tend to throw out these negative words to describe people going through a faith transition from a perspective of kind of demonizing that process.
Right. Okay.
One of the problems I see is that back in the 80s, there were a group of us who were trying to do the very thing that Patrick Mason is doing now, reaching out to people who were damaged. And we got thrown out for our trouble. And I'm thinking, Daniel Rector, who was a son of Hartman Rector Jr., he was the head of Sunstone Foundation for a while, and others, Lavina Anderson and Mike Quinn and myself, my wife Margaret, Janice Allred, my sister-in-law, Todd Compton, a whole group, some of which are academic scholars, were believing, and maybe we still are to some extent, who are trying to reach out. But he doesn't address those people who were thrown out for doing the very thing that they are trying to do now. And when Kate Kelly started to ordain women, I talked to her and I said, Kate, they're going to throw you out. And she says, oh no, it wouldn't happen now, because that was just kind of ancient history. Well, John DeLynn got thrown out, and so did Kate Kelly, and some others too. It's not always clear that we don't know their names sometimes. And so it is dangerous to enter into these waters. It is the apostles' job, and if somebody tries to take their job, sometimes those people get into the crosshairs of the church leadership. And I'm troubled by all of this, because I think that this is an attempt to try to help.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to your initial point of why aren't the apostles the ones who are making these overtures? And you're correctly pointing out, later on in the talk, he's going to acknowledge some things which have gotten people excommunicated in the past. Mm-hmm. And to me, as I listen to this talk, you have to wonder, who is he talking to? Is he saying that the members themselves need to make these allowances? Because he's calling for some cultural changes and for some thought changes. but the people who can make those changes are the brethren. So I kind of look at his talk as though he were lecturing the brethren, but doing it in a safe format by directing his comments towards members.
Interesting.
So keep that in mind as you listen, and let's continue.
Out of the church, I think they might have had different outcomes if they had found satisfactory answers or a sympathetic community sooner. I recently had a long lunch with an old friend from graduate school. We hadn't seen each other since then, and at the time he was a real gung-ho member of the ward. I mean, absolute, very active member. We hadn't been in touch for years, but he reached out to me by email, said he had read my book and wanted to talk. So we met at lunch, and he told me how over the past couple years he started questioning the church, primarily because of information he encountered on various websites and podcasts. Within a few months, he went from full activity to total anger and bitterness, leaving the church entirely and wanting absolutely nothing to do with it.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there because this is one of the problematic parts of his talk, I think, and particularly when he says he went from full activity to anger and bitterness, leaving the church entirely and wanting absolutely nothing to do with it. Because when I hear apologists describe the process of apostasy or a faith crisis, and they use that term bitterness, that's a very loaded term.
Yes.
Because it implies certain things about the person who is bitter. It implies that they're prideful, that they've got enmity between them and God, and between them and the church leaders, and that they are so, that pride has filled them up so much that now they're lashing out in anger. Would you agree, Alison?
Yes, absolutely. This was a big. This paragraph, I found it ironic because so much of the rest of his talk is very empathetic and understanding and reaching out, but he prefaces it all with this just very interesting paragraph here where he talks about his friend. And the thing is that, from interacting and working with a lot of different people with Mormon spectrum, he doesn't, where are the words that describes how his friend probably had sadness and despair and discouragement and feelings of betrayal. He chooses anger and bitterness, which is just very stereotypical.
Yeah. Paul, what about you? Did that language jump out at you?
Oh yes, it's very disturbing. And I remember a story about Ralph Waldo Emerson visiting Henry David Thoreau when Thoreau was in jail. And Emerson says to him, "David, what are you doing in there?" And he says, "Ralph, what are you doing out there?" And that is, Henry David Thoreau was put in jail for being a protester, a dissenter, and he's wondering why Ralph Emerson is outside jail and not having done any protesting. And in a sense, this is what I feel here. It's a little bit blaming the victim. I mean, if somebody cheated you and sold you the Brooklyn Bridge, you would naturally be angry, maybe bitter, certainly indignant that you'd been taken advantage of. But it seems like we're always, Mormonism has got this, I call it the tyranny of the nice. We have to be nice. And if we get angry or show any kind of emotion or feel that you stand up for ourselves on our hind legs like good bipeds and object, then somebody's going to say you're bitter. Well, of course I'm bitter. You've eaten up my life. You took away my youth. You made me pay all that tithing, and then you're telling me you actually weren't in communication with Jesus every Thursday? Come on. Who wouldn't be angry? And,
now, Paul, contention is of the devil. We know that.
Yeah, well, that's not what the Scripture says. The Scripture says contention, of course, if it means warfare, that is true. But if it's talking about disputation, then, of course, St. Paul disputed and other people dispute, and we dispute these things to kind of come to an understanding of what we actually believe.
Yeah, well, that's not what Christ said when he was in the Book of Mormon. He specifically talks about contention regarding doctrinal disputes.
Yeah, well, he's also the one who kicked over the money changers in the temple and made a whip. So the Book of Mormon has to be understood in the context of what Jesus also did, not just what he said. Yes, contention where you're throwing each other out of the church, which is what they were doing.
Yeah.
And they're excommunicating people and treating people like they have less value because of their religious beliefs within the community. That is the kind of contention that Jesus objected to. But if you're talking about, you know, you have a difference of opinion on a question that reasonable people could differ on, then I don't think that's really contention. That's just sorting out issues.
Right. And so using the words anger and bitterness, I think the points you both have made are very pertinent. What I wish that what Fair Mormon would do is go and follow some podcasts from ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and just look at how they react towards their organization when they leave. And many times they feel like they've been robbed of certain aspects of their life, that their own identities were so enmeshed with that false organization that it robbed them of their identity. And so once they actually realize what trauma has been done to themselves, they do feel a great deal of anger and bitterness. And it's not born out of Satan taking hold of their heart. It's born out of real hurt, real pain, and real suffering. And if you don't have the empathy to understand that that process is real, then it's like going to a grieving widow and kicking dust in her face and saying, get over it. You know, how dare you grieve? And,
right, and that's why I found it just so interesting, because it's not that people who leave the church and his friend, who he's using in this example, didn't feel anger and bitterness. I would venture to guess that that's pretty typical. It's just that they feel lots of other things too. And what's a little bit unfortunate is the choice of just the two adjectives he used.
Yeah. Now, I found it very interesting. Well, let it continue in a second, just briefly, because he says something that I think is almost positive. So we'll see it.
Wait. Before you do, there's another little point, and that is, and I'll be really quick. He's describing somebody who he claims has gone from certain belief to certain unbelief, leaping from a kind of very rooted faith to a complete atheism. I'm not sure that that's a fair characteristic, because that may mellow over time. A person may, because they're upset at being deceived, they feel, they may go all the way to atheism, but later on they may pull back and say, well, I do believe in some kind of spirituality. But I think this characterization is unfair, especially when somebody has just realized that they may have been deceived.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so real briefly, let's see where he goes from there.
He's since mellowed out a little bit, thanks in part to attending a post-Mormon support group.
Okay, so Patrick Mason just gave a shout-out to the same groups that are in Mormon Spectrum.
I know, I love it.
And this is actually like an important part of a faith transition. And if you're all alone and you're going through a faith crisis, it can be so difficult, versus if you have regular get-togethers at a coffee house, or just get-togethers at a play date or something, where you can talk in a group of people who aren't going to judge you for having opinions and feelings that may be outside of the Chapel Mormon worldview. That's so therapeutic, and it does actually have that effect of helping you work through the anger, bitter ex-Mormon phase.
It does. I loved that he did that. That he actually recognized that had been a positive for his friend, had helped him.
Yeah, he doesn't dwell on it too much, but it's there.
Yeah, it's there.
All right, let's keep going.
He can now attend sacrament meeting with family members, but he's still contemplating removing his name from the records. At lunch, we had a great conversation. We were both very honest with each other about where we're at in our respective faith journeys and why we feel the way we do. A couple days later, he emailed me and wistfully said, "If only I had reconnected with you first." Emotionally and intellectually and spiritually, he feels it's simply too late to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But one of the reasons I wrote Planted was to try and preempt some of those tumbles off the wall, to give all the king's horses and all the king's men and women some ideas on how we might help keep people on the wall, or failing that, at least understand what happens and act with compassion when they fall off.
Okay, so here's another little part that kind of fits with some of the other things, where some of the imagery that he's using, I would say, is a little bit problematic and a little bit stereotypical and generalizing. I don't know how about you guys felt about that, but
what do you mean?
Well, the idea of Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall, that imagery is is that his friend or the member fell off the wall, that they just didn't hold on to the wall. And his thing of, how do we keep people on that wall or from falling off that wall? I would almost venture the imagery would be a little more accurate sometimes to say that the church fell off the wall.
Yeah.
That as people did their homework and research, they realized that the church was not fitting their needs and filling it. And either, you know what I mean? That imagery just puts a lot of blame, and I don't know, it's just somehow it's unsettling to me that it doesn't fit with a lot of the rest of the stuff that he says. I just find it surprising.
And on the line of blaming the victim, he's basically saying if only that person had been exposed to these enlightened ways of looking at things that he's going to now share with us, or that you can get in his book, then maybe that would have happened. And it's the victim's, in a sense, the victim's fault for not either realizing it himself or having someone else expose him to these particular ideas.
Right.
And so, Paul, do you? I guess for you, it's a little bit different because one of the things about you is that you're not one of these militant, angry atheists that a lot of ex-Mormons become. So how did you interact with this Humpty Dumpty idea?
Well, I think it's more like you've been told by your parents that they're putting away money for you in a college account, and then when you go to the account, there's nothing there. It's really that your parents have lied to you. I mean, he's talking about this nuanced way. Well, I'm a literary guy. I mean, I studied Northrop Frye when I was younger, and I'm still doing it. The new critics and trying to understand literature and Bible and sacred texts. Well, that people aren't going to do that because they're not trained to do that. They're going to Sunday school and they're expected to getting the truth in Sunday school. They're supposed to get it when they study their priesthood manual, when they study the scriptures and Sunday school, and the high council comes around and bores you to death, but at least they should tell you the truth. But then you find out that you've been believing all of this stuff, and it turns out to be some kind of spin. It's propaganda of some kind, and it's very disturbing. It isn't, I think what happens is that I could kind of forgive Joseph Smith for some of the things he did, because I can't really go back that far and figure out why that happened exactly. But if the leaders of the church since had told me the truth about it, I might have been able to say, oh, yeah, we had to get past that, but at least we have this. But when you find out all of a sudden, it's like you've been sitting on this plank and somebody throws a baseball and you're dunked into cold water all of a sudden, and you feel like you've been deceived and you can't trust the leader. Here's the problem. People say, well, our leaders are imperfect. Well, that's not the problem. They're untrustworthy. Yeah. It's not that they're imperfect. It's that you can't trust them to tell you the truth. And if you have parents like this, pretty soon you say, I'm just not going to trust them anymore. Yeah. That's the problem.
Well, see, I'm going to push back on that idea a little bit because for a lot of the post-Mormon community, their perspective isn't even that they were lied to. And the thing is, the church is now trying to solve that problem by their inoculation process. We'll tell them these difficult truths in a faithful context so that they won't feel lied to. The problem is that unless you separate the very literal roots of Mormonism, where they made claims about what the Book of Mormon actually is, and the contents of the Book of Mormon actually represent, and the angel actually visiting, and all these other things that are very rooted in concrete things, well, that's what Mormonism is, in a sense. He came out with this idea that something being authentic, whether it's priesthood authority or this particular scripture coming from golden plates, that authenticity was what made Mormonism so valuable, because it hadn't been distorted by the philosophies of men and different interpretations of men. Well, what people like Patrick Mason are doing is, and Bushman to some extent, is they're saying, well, let's let go of that literal interpretation and let's do what all these other religions have done, and let's just look at our religion through the eye of metaphor. And that works for other religions to some extent, because they're not claiming that their leaders speak for God, with a few exceptions, but that their leaders are simply men like you and I, women like you and I, that are trying to find light in a dark world. And so in that paradigm, you can look at metaphor. But when you talk about our leader is the spokesperson for God, and our decree that gay Mormon children of gay couples can't get the blessings of the baptism, and that's the Word of God. That's a very different, concrete versus metaphorical paradigm, and so that's the difficulty that people are going to have with that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's continue.
To me, it's essential to actually hear the voices of those who are struggling. No one narrative is representative of the whole. Everybody has a different story. But as just one example of the type of person who is doing all he can to hang on and to stay in, I want to read, with his permission, excerpts from an email that I recently received. And this is a little bit lengthy. He says, most of the stuff I've read online that attacks polygamy and the Book of Mormon translation issues tend to spin the quotes and facts they use pretty hard. And it's amazing how good they are at lulling you away into not critically examining their claims and doing your own research.
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. Now, it has to be understood that these are not Patrick's words. He's
Right.
reading and quoting a letter, but he selected this part of the letter.
Exactly.
And he doesn't refute some of the things that he says. So he's conveying this and to the audience as part of his message. Now, saying that people who attack polygamy and Book of Mormon translation issues are spinning quotes and facts and lulling you into not critically examining claims and doing your research is a complete mischaracterization. That's
I agree.
In my own research and the stuff that I write on my blog, any claim that I make, I always try to link back to original source documents, mostly on church servers if they're available there. And I know some of the things that I've read from you, Alison, when I believe you did a response to the one of the polygamy essays and everything. There's always, here's some factual information. Now go confirm it yourself. Would you say that was your experience?
Absolutely, and I think, again, this is just, I find it actually kind of astonishing that he's prefacing his remarks using some of the examples that he's picking, because this really feeds into, I see all the time online, this generalization of people who've left, they only read one thing. They only look at one website or a couple, negative websites, and and that they don't really thoroughly investigate it. And it's one of the things that I've pushed back on with Mormon Spectrum and why we have so many different resources on there. We have the whole gamut on there, from all the official church sites to everything. I actually don't believe that that's the case. Sure, there are going to be some people who do that, but I think using this example just really feeds into some inaccurate stereotypes.
Right. I basically compare what you and I have probably gone through, where you spend days and hours poring over original resources. Like I remember one of my things was, like, I first heard Joseph Smith married other men's wives. I'm like, what? That can't be true. And so it took me days and weeks to go and chase down original sources and finally come to that acknowledgement. Right. Now compare that with the Chapel Mormon who sits in Sunday school and gets a whitewashed version of history and doesn't think about it or do any research at all. Or if they do come across a question, they ask a question to their high priest apologist, and he says, oh, don't worry about that, there's an answer for it. And then they say, okay, that's it. And they don't think about it, they don't research it, they don't verify it, because the answer they were given fits into that faithful paradigm.
Right.
Now Paul, Alison, and I went through this transition in an age where it was so easy to find this information. You just click on a link, boom, there's it on the church website, or there it is on Sandra Tanner's website, and so you can see those documents. Now, when you were originally kind of finding a more nuanced, a more complex understanding of things, you didn't have those resources available. So how was that process different?
We absolutely had them.
How did you have them?
That's totally untrue. Mike Quinn had dug through all of this stuff back in the 60s and early 70s. In the 70s, I went through all of the church. It was open. I could walk into the church, 47 East South Temple. They had microfilm readers in the hallways. Joseph Fielding Smith Jr. was available. He would be wandering down the hallway. You could get in and you could read, and I did. I was perfectly aware that before I went on my mission in 1966, I was perfectly aware that Joseph Smith had been engaged in polyandry, because polygamy meant both polyandry and polygyny, and I had seen the records myself. I saw the records later when people sealed him to Joan of Arc and Teresa of Avila and saw those sealing records. I in the Manti Temple before I went on my mission. I saw the second anointing records on these big volumes, and
okay,
I was
would
aware
you
of this.
describe your experience as commonplace, as easy for anyone
no,
to do,
I'm not
or
saying,
as unique?
it was unique, but what I'm saying is it's curious that I can't answer the question why it just didn't bother me in the way that it bothers. It just, when I realized it was a weird religion from the beginning. I was a convert from Catholicism. I mean, you're talking about a religion that starts with somebody looking at a stone and a hat. Okay, fine. I mean, it's not going to. You got to get past all of that. If you get into the New Testament, you've got the resurrection from the dead. I mean, once you believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, you're more or less on a slippery slope. Anything after that is small potatoes. I mean, and I don't know what we're talking about here. I mean, I can perfectly understand that if you can't believe in a supernatural world and that it infuses itself into the natural world in a mysterious way, if you can't believe in that, then I think that's perfectly rational. I would think that you should not try. I mean, you should go with the science thing, because that's the better view. But once you were in Mormonism, you were taught about the resurrection, and once you believe that, I think angels and stones and hats and all of this other stuff, you have to look at it from a very different perspective. I'm not blaming people for not being able to do that. I think they've got to follow what they believe is true. I think one of the things that the leaders have done is create a box in which people feel, I mean, they don't feel free, and they didn't have the resources. And so I don't blame anybody, and I don't have much judgment for people making the decisions that they do. I see it's obvious that they have to.
Well, it sounds like you didn't fall into what he's talking about in terms of you didn't find that there was a problem with people not allowing you to do your research. You did all the research, and you knew about all of these things.
And they threw me out.
Because of that, they threw
it. That's right.
Wait a second. So that means you were one of the people
who
were lulling people away into not critically examining your findings.
No, we were telling people all about it at Sunstone, and you know, when my wife Margaret gave the talk on Joseph Smith's promises of fullness of the priesthood to the Relief Society at the organization of the Relief Society, she did that in a speech given in 1984, and it was so overwhelming to people that they made her give it a second time the next day. And people were completely astounded that Joseph Smith had said that women should get the fullness of the priesthood and were on an equal footing with men. Well, it's there. I mean, there's a lot of material out there, but I feel that what happens is that in the ward, and he did talk about this guy being in a ward, right?
Yeah.
We're not just in a ward, we're in a church. And the bishop and the stake president, there's a program to keep people in their ward doing good things and not knowing about church history and church theology. The manuals are there to close questions, not to answer questions. And that has now, those chickens have now come home to roost. And we were warning people about the correlation committee. I had meetings that we back in the 80s where we were trying to get the leaders of the church to realize that they were going down a path of control that was going to have repercussions years later. But they didn't believe. They just kept, and even now they keep doing it. So I'm sorry, I'm saying too much.
It's good to see that history, because I think the changes in the pace and everything was so different back then than what we're seeing now, because then you had a small group of people that were exploring these ideas, coming out with narratives that were different from the conventional narrative, and now it's just worldwide, and especially in the younger generation that have access to this information. So he says a couple of things later on in just same paragraph that I think are important. Let's take a look.
It's little wonder to me why people leave the church so quickly after learning some of these issues, because there are people out there that have mastered the craft of presenting their information as infallible and their opinions as ironclad.
Well, who is he talking about?
I want to know,
because who is he talking about that has the ability to advance the infallible? I mean, who is he talking about?
I will tell you that I used to have that type of view of the general authorities. And so anytime there was a question of anything, well, I don't know if something's right or wrong, let's see what the general authorities have to say about it. You know, in vitro fertilization, is that right or wrong? Well, let's see what the general authorities have to say about it. You know, abortion in cases of rape, is that right? Or, well, let's because your only moral principle is obedience to the general authorities. And so when I finally started to see that there were problems there, it actually gave me great distrust for the people who were telling me these things about Joseph Smith. And so I specifically would not see their viewpoint as infallible, because I had to find out if it was true, and only when it was validated by the references on the church's own website would I then have to acknowledge that and then incorporate that into how I was looking at things. Would you agree with that, Alison, or was your experience different?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure who he's talking about when he says people out there that have mastered the craft of presenting their information as infallible. I'm not sure who he's talking about, because, you know, people that are doing their research and homework are reading a whole variety of sources. You know, they're reading Quinn, and they're reading Bushman, and they're reading Givens, and they're reading the official stuff, and they're reading, you know, they're reading everything.
You're not going to let your eternal salvation and that of your family disappear or be in jeopardy just because of some anonymous blogger guy on the internet who happens to turn a phrase.
Right.
All right. Well, let's. Anything to add on that one, Paul?
No.
All right. Let's keep going.
I know there's a certain stigma around this online material, and I completely agree that it's toxic. But once a seed of doubt has been planted and you begin to lose trust in what you've always believed, that stigma starts to fade, and you start thinking you need to get your information from somewhere.
Yes. That is a good thing. Imagine like Bernie Madoff's victims. You know, once they saw that the numbers didn't add up and they started to have doubt and lose their trust, then they did need to start getting their information from other places. That's how you protect yourself when you discover that there's something amiss.
Right.
I don't know why that's talked of in a demonizing sort of way.
Well, and the reality is that you don't know where to go to get the information. So I find it so interesting that he paints this kind of in a negative way. The reason why people have to figure out where to go is because they can't get the information from the place that they thought they could get it from. Which is church.
And that speaks to your first point, Paul, in terms of, you know, why aren't the brethren coming out and answering these things? Why aren't their signatures on the gospel topic essays?
Well, I know why they don't. And that is because they're trapped. Because for 150, 160 years, they have followed their seniors in authority. And once their senior says something, they can't go back and really reverse it. And so what they do is they pretend like if it's not working out, they make some kind of plausible statement and they keep going. You take the racism of Brigham Young. They can't go and say Brigham Young was a racist. He was a thug and a racist. And the 12 apostles took over the church at the trial of Sidney Rigdon when they had no authority to do it. And and since then, they've tried to run the church. Fortunately, corporatism developed in the late 19th century, so they were able to model the church on a corporation, and the 12 apostles, rather than being sent out into the mission field to be a traveling high council of missionaries, like it says in the 107th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. Instead of doing that, they stayed in Salt Lake and acted as a board of directors underneath the first presidency, which altered the management of the church. And then they, you know, they get up and say things in conference, and once they've said it in conference, how do you take it back? And so you have accretion on accretion of many nonsensical things that get in there. And how do you pull back without violating the principle of being obedient to the senior apostle? You can't. and then you're stuck in this. So now that Elder Russell Nelson, who's president of the Council of the 12, has stated that this policy about not baptizing the children of parents who are in a same-sex marriage is a revelation. Good Lord, how do you
untangle that?
Without saying that he is not speaking for the Lord, and he's not speaking for the Lord. You can just tell, because the Lord would not say, don't. He says, "Suffer the little children to come unto me," and they're saying something that is directly repugnant to the teaching of Jesus Christ when he was on earth, and they don't get to do that. They don't get to change the words of the Lord. They get to go out and preach the word of the Lord.
Yeah.
And that's the problem in a nutshell. And I said it for 30 years, going on 40 years, and people like the Givenses and even the Bushmans, whom I respect, do not want to say that. These guys have peed in the soup.
I mean, the last line is what really, this is the part that when he talks about, first off, where does that stigma come from looking for answers in material? I would venture that the stigma comes from the church itself. The church itself has taught that there's this stigma of looking outside the official correlated material in order to get answers. And he's painting this as, well, gee, once you've got that, seed of doubt's been planted, you start to, that stigma starts to fade of what you're going to look at, and then you start thinking, oh, I got to go outside the correlated material to find these answers. And he's exactly right. That's exactly what happens, because you start to realize you can't find the information in the manuals that you use to teach your Sunday school lessons. That you just can't find the information, and so you have to start looking for it. So he says this in a way that it's a negative, but it is the reality. That's what happens.
Kind of like if you have a married couple and one of them is having an affair, and the one who's having an affair tells the one who's questioning, are you having an affair? That no, I'm true to you. When I'm gone, I'm not meeting out this other person and everything. And so they put these lies forward. If you only believe those things, you're never going to discover that there's a deception. You have to look outside that. Just like if you look at Jehovah's Witnesses, if you look at Scientologists, they have to look at what other sources say in order for them to escape those false ideologies. And so, but on the other hand, if you have a married couple and they're actually being true to each other, then if one of them were to go and investigate other things, they wouldn't find problems because the problems aren't there.
And I would say this speaks to Paul and Michael Quinn and all of the other people who for years and years and years have tried to discuss some of these things, have tried to encourage the church to be more open about these messy details, and that we're basically told to stop.
Yeah.
All
right, let's keep going. He's got a lot to go through.
I feel kind of exhausted with examining these types of controversial issues. So, he said, I really do. At times I've wondered if I believe mostly because I want it all to be true so badly. I want there to be more to life, and I want to know that our family relationships and existence perpetuate after we die. I want it to be true that somebody is hearing and answering my prayers, and the feelings that I have in my heart are coming from a source greater than myself. I want to believe that forgiveness of sins is possible and that Christ truly lives. There are still things that I think will always be puzzling to me. There's a plausible narrative that you could construct, and many people do, about it all being a lie. But there's also a plausible narrative that you can construct that it is all true. Sometimes I feel like I'm having to make allowance for a lot of ambiguity and shortcomings of men.
I think, Paul, you're a good example of how there's a little bit of a false dichotomy that comes up here, which is that if you lose faith in the church, then you lose any spiritual identity at all. And the natural and unavoidable consequence is that you become a raving atheist who's militantly now wants to go and deprive all religious people of their rights. And so now we have to have a campaign to preserve religious rights. How do you take that, Paul?
Well, the idea that it's either all a lie or all true is the problem of Mormonism.
That's exactly right.
That is the problem of Mormonism. And it's so hard for me to address this in little sound bites, and I'm going to try to do it because I respect both of you, and I certainly am illuminated by what you have to say. But for me, the big problem with Mormonism was that it tried to prove that it was right by the gold plates, or the morality of Joseph Smith, or the goodness of the apostles, or the goodness that the church does. This is nonsensical. You can't prove that the church is true in the sense that you can prove that, you know, there's food in the refrigerator. It's not the same kind of thing. The Book of Mormon's frontispiece tells us what the Book of Mormon is for. It's for the convincing of Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself to all nations. It's not to prove that Joseph Smith is a real prophet, or that Mormonism is really true, or any of that. It's supposed to convince, but we never have explained to people how this is. And it's very difficult now, after 186 years of Mormonism, to go back and try to get that right. But let me try to state it this way, because I think this is extremely important. The New Testament gives us little koans, little statements of Jesus, and little vignettes that have to be unpacked. And in attempting to unpack these in the New Testament, you have Catholicism and Protestantism and all the denominations and societies of Christianity. You have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. You've got the Coptic Church. You've got so much of Christianity all over, and they disagree on how to unpack the New Testament. The Book of Mormon was supposed to help us do that because it takes the teachings of Jesus and tries to make propositional statements in a way that would be more accessible to people in the 19th century, maybe even in the 20th century. But we don't pay attention to the message because we're so focused on the means and the translation, and we're running around in Central America looking for Nephi's garbage, trying to find something to show that really Joseph Smith was not a fraud. Never proved that. So what we get mixed up. Yes, I know that was we get the idea, and you're just going to say it, Jonathan. But the whole point of Mormonism was to give us something an iron rod that we could hang on to. But that was the early members wanted to solve the problem that was raised in the burnt-over district of New York, trying to find primitive Christianity, and you can't. And the Book of Mormon doesn't say that it's going to convince you of what try to restore the primitive church. It says it's going to convince you that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. It's a very personal thing. And so I believe we go off the rails at a very early period. We take now 186 years later, we're way out here in the wrong place, trying to prove that we're right and the evangelicals are wrong, except about gay things.
Now, I'll tell you that, all us wacky, modern ex-Mormons and everything, we look at the question of that and we say, okay, well, if that's the case, how do you distinguish that particular question from somebody like Chris Nemelka? Now, if you're not familiar with Chris Nemelka, he is a guy who claims to be reincarnated Hiram Smith. He has produced an actual scripture in terms of the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. It speaks in scriptural language. It talks more about Christ, about the prophets. It brings up more theological points. It answers questions. And so somebody who's been captured by his fraud now is presented with the same thing. They can either try to look at what the meaning of that false scripture that he's brought forth is, or they can identify it as a fraud and say, well, wait a second, that is a fraud. Now, I don't know what's true, but I can at least discard that. And so a lot of Mormons that see these problems with Joseph Smith, his personal character issues, the plagiarism in the Book of Mormon, the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, rather than say, well, I'm going to ignore those things and then just look for the metaphor and the meaning and the language about Christ. I'm just going to reject it and say that reveals it to be a fraud, and then go and step back and find where, if any, spiritual value they can find in the message of Christianity or anything else. Now that's a little bit of a diversion from what he's talking about here, but I think
that's what the apostles would have to address if
yes.
they're going to address the faith crises of people.
Yeah.
They're going to have to address the question: is if Mormonism is based upon a stone in a hat and a translation that we find no historical evidence for, and if the Book of Abraham seems to be more channeling than an actual translation of anything that Abraham wrote, how are we to be protected from people like Nemelka and the lost 160, the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon?
You've got to be able to detect a fraud and discern truth from error.
Right.
But if you apply those same tools that would help you detect the fraud of Nemelka to Joseph Smith, you end up detecting him as a fraud as well. And so,
or
I think
you find out that Nemelka is telling you the truth.
Well, I don't know that anyone's found that out yet. Most of the people that start looking at it honestly find the other way around, but I could be wrong.
I haven't looked at it. I'm not suggesting that it is the truth. I mean, look, if you believe in, this is what the apostles have never wanted to deal with. They start a church where you have continuing revelation, and then they have no mechanism for distinguishing the fraud, the lunatic, the con man from a legitimate mystical experience. And they don't let anybody participate in it. They can't decide. I have no answer to this myself, but I did know early on that, because when I was being converted to Mormonism when I was just 16, I said, well, I don't know that Joseph Smith is a prophet. How do you tell? And there was no really good answer to that. My belief was that you have to find the religion in the texts. And I think, what's his name, Nemelka? I don't know. Yeah. I can't remember. Chris Nemelka. Yeah. You have to look at the text. You have to go through the trouble of looking at it and determining whether you think that this is something that comes out of a mind that's disturbed, or could it really be a mystical experience. My feeling is, because it has a copycat quality to it, and it's seizing upon something that's already happened, that it's a disingenuous and uncreative effort to try to make something of yourself and become a somebody.
People look at the Book of Mormon and they say that's exactly what it is. It capitalized on the war, the late war. It capitalized on the view of the Hebrews. It capitalized on the interest in answering questions such as infant baptism, universalism, things like that. And so they see it as the same thing. If they let go of the reverence for it. But I guess the thing that Patrick says here that spawned this conversation is that there's a plausible narrative about it being all a lie. And I think a lot of us that have stepped away from the church, that's the connection that we made.
Yes, and there is a very plausible. I agree with that.
And then he says there's a plausible narrative that it's all true, and that's a difficult statement, because even people that hold faith, there's a lot of areas where, well, we'll get the answer to that in the afterlife, which means that they don't have a narrative that answers it in this life.
I was actually kind of surprised that he stated it in such black and white terms. I'm not sure.
Especially since he's arguing for nuance, which is specifically eschewing black and white.
This was a little bit puzzling to me, this paragraph.
Yeah. But again, this is the letter from the person. These are not Patrick's words.
Yeah.
So he asked, where do you think that leaves me? At this point, I feel like my personal beliefs aren't quite in line with most members of the LDS Church. I am in line with the core doctrines and beliefs, but I just feel like once you've wandered down that rabbit hole, if you decide to stick around for a while, I think it forces you to confront the fact that our past leaders have made mistakes, and our history as a church is pretty messy and unclear in a few spots. It leaves me uncertain about where exactly to draw the line on what to consider infallible doctrine and what to consider the opinions of sincere but flawed leaders called of God.
Any comments on that letter? He just ended the letter.
I mean, I think the end of that is right on point. I mean, I would say that uncertainty about where to draw that line definitely becomes an issue for people who, after they've researched and studied.
Yeah, I think it's a little telling that he selected a letter from a member or from somebody who, if they can still say that they hold to the core beliefs of the church, then my suspicion is that they still have a little bit of research to do. There's still some areas that they haven't really explored, because one of the core beliefs of the church deals with the ability of prophets to discern truth from error and to act as a voice for the will of God. And you can know this because if you stand up and say, you prophet are saying something that's false, and I'm going to disbelieve you and I'm going to teach other people that you say something is false, then they get kicked out or they get disciplined. And that's where Stuart Udall did this on the race issue. Laurie Nelson did this, and each time they were reproved by the prophet. And so it's a really difficult thing to not go that far and look at the prophets that way and not throw out the baby in the bathwater. All right, let's keep.
Well, on the whole core, I mean, there is a little bit, it's a little bit difficult to even know what does he mean by the core doctrines and beliefs of the church anyway. That whole idea of, okay, what exactly are the core doctrines of the church seems to,
right.
There seems to be quite a bit of disagreement about that.
That's a fair point.
That note really captures so much of what I've heard from so many people. Maybe you've had similar conversations as well. New discoveries on the internet, feelings of confusion and doubt, being wary of the stigma associated with doubt, and mostly suffering silently. Mental and emotional and spiritual exhaustion, grappling with fallibility, and remodeling the house of faith in the midst of both uncertainty and newfound wisdom. So now let me share what I wrote back to him, which will be a kind of template for the rest of my remarks. I said, "You're exactly the type of person I wrote Planted for, a real seeker who is willing to put in the time and the work, not someone who's ready to bail at the first sign of trouble."
Allison, I'll let you address that.
I'm not sure why he does this, because, his last paragraph was really wonderful. When he describes, this captures so much of what I've learned from so many people, and he talks about, he paints the picture of, the doubt, the mental, emotional, spiritual exhaustion, the grappling with his prophetic fallibility, all those things. And then he comes back and kind of makes another couple statements where it's kind of like, you're the person who wants to bail at the first sign of trouble. So he has several parts in here which I find quite fascinating, because he seems to start on a real nuanced kind of empathetic understanding, and then he'll come back and say something that's just really stereotypical or generalized.
Yeah.
So,
Paul, you didn't get a chance to bail at the first sign of trouble because they done kicked you out.
And I don't think people are bailing at the first sign of trouble. I think that they see an avalanche of trouble, and they're being kind of pushed out, because it's like being pushed out by the snow in an avalanche. I don't think they can cope with it because they haven't been. The church does nothing to help them cope. For example, going to the temple for the first time. What have the brethren ever done to help people prepare for the rich symbolism of the temple when, Sunday meetings are so symbol poor, and all of a sudden you're smacked with all of these strange robes and gestures and symbols and whatever? They're totally unprepared for it. And that's the whole...
I think the Mormons that were Masons before they went to the temple probably were prepared for it.
Yeah. I don't think so, because it's, you can take the stars in the sky and you can connect them into the traditional constellations, or you can connect them into, like Woody Allen said, there's the constellation Lumides the pants salesman, or the constellation Taco. You can make up your own constellations. And I think it has to be explained to people, and they have to be nurtured in a way so that they can deal with these things. But it doesn't answer your foundational question, which is, Mormonism purports to be the one and only true church. The LDS Church purports to be that.
Yep.
That is not what I don't believe that that's what the religion was started out to be, to create the one and only true. I believe it was to convince people that Jesus was the Christ, and that the Book of Mormon does that. If you see the foundational doctrines, which he refers to in the letter as foundational teachings, what are those? Alison, you said, what are they? Well, it's not polygamy. It's not the historical parts of the Book of Mormon. It's the things that I think explain the messianic message of the New Testament. That's what the book is for. Now, it's true. What you say is that, well, shouldn't Mormonism be more than that? Well, I think to the extent that it gets to be more than that, it gets itself into trouble, because you can't justify so much of that's happened in Mormonism from that perspective.
Well, then you have to go back to Mormonism before this alleged priesthood restoration, because as soon as you have a priesthood with the importance of authenticity and legitimacy, and then saving ordinances that are dependent on that priesthood, then the one true church becomes very important, because you have to go through that pathway in order to get salvation. And the soteriology becomes the binding glue that keeps people adherent to that a line of authority. But even with that being said, what you're describing are all the benefits of Mormonism, the importance of it, and the fact that that is what we all grew up in means that this notion that you're going to bail at the first sign of trouble is just a gross caricature of what it is like to go through a faith crisis. You don't bail from something where you were told that your eternal salvation and your ability to be with your family for eternity is dependent on adhering to it. That's not something you bail over at the first sign of trouble. I don't think he's giving credit to the experience that we go through. All right, let's keep going.
As I read your message, 2 lines stuck out to me. So I believe, I really do. I want to believe. And there are still things that I think will always be puzzling to me. This is pretty much exactly where I find myself, I told him. And of course it is reminiscent of the New Testament. Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Mormonism is distinctive among successful global religions in the sense that it was born in the Enlightenment age. One thing that's happened is that many Mormons operating in modes similar to Protestant fundamentalists have sought to gain or impose the same type of modern scientific certainty on their religious faith as they do the natural world. Thus, all the hullabaloo about scientific and archaeological evidences for the Book of Mormon, etc. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with formulating rational grounds for belief. To the contrary, I think the anti-intellectual strain within Mormonism and American culture more generally may be even more problematic.
I think that's a fair acknowledgement. I've been told that I'm taking, as I study and talk about the things that I had, I've been told that I take it too seriously. That I'm just, the implication is that when you read and you find contradictions, you should be quiet about them, or you shouldn't talk about them, or you shouldn't follow them out to their natural conclusions, when that's kind of what the intellectual process demands. If I've made certain choices and certain decisions in my life based on the idea that certain things are true, if I learn that they're not true, or there's something that calls that into question, you kind of have to talk about it because it has real effects. And so he gives some good lip service to the idea that we do need to apply some aspects of rational thought to our religion and theology. But let's see where he goes with it.
But it's ultimately a question of parallel and in some ways competing epistemologies. The scientific revolution has wrought wonders in our world because we've been better able to apprehend our natural world through rigorous inquiry. Some people believe that there is nothing that escapes those naturalistic tools and methods. I personally believe that there are elements of the cosmos and the human experience that go beyond what could ever be perceived, measured, or fully understood through naturalistic methods, no matter how refined. I would count among these things the central claims of Christianity: the existence of God, the resurrection of Jesus, and the reality and workings of the Holy Spirit. These are quite literally articles of faith that can neither be proven nor disproven by a naturalistic, rationalistic Enlightenment approach to knowledge.
Okay.
I found this part to be really interesting because I agree completely that there are certain aspects of faith and religious belief that cannot be measured and studied through scientific method and like he explains. I have often shared that with people when I've talked about how my experience, the belief that does God exist or not, the belief is there an afterlife or not. There are lots of those types of things which they're really just boil down to basic faith, cannot be studied or proven or measured or things like that. But the thing is that he's kind of rolled both of these into this strange kind of thing. He starts this whole conversation off with the example of the Book of Mormon and archaeological evidence, and then he switches over to these things that cannot be proven or studied or measured, like the existence of God. To me, that's really odd. He's lumped them both together because the reality is there are certain specific claims that Mormonism makes and that the church has made, which are foundational to the claims that they make about their authority and that can actually be measured and studied. So, the Book of Mormon they have never, ever taught that the Book of Mormon was not a literal history of actual people that at some point existed. Now, there may be disagreement about where they lived and existed, what
Right.
continent they lived in, but there's never been any kind of official stance on the fact that this was metaphorical, that there were never actual Nephites or Lamanites. This has always been taught as a literal history. And so if it's a literal history and there are specific things that are taught, there are some of those things that can actually be studied and measured. So I'm not sure why he starts off with the Book of Mormon as an example, and then he goes to this totally other realm of things that have to be relied on purely by faith.
Well, I think this is speaking to the same thing that you'll see in any religious charlatan, and that is that we have this thing called faith, which is a way for us to capture the minds of followers so that they will suspend their desire for proof and hold on to belief. And if we can say that about metaphysical things like the existence of God or whether or not you love your spouse, there's no way to prove those things. Well, then if we can just get them to turn their critical minds off for that, then we can extend that to the things which could otherwise objectively demonstrate the falseness of the group. So
Right.
you can go back to the Christian Scientists. You can say, well, if if we believe in God, if we can't look at God critically, then maybe you also shouldn't look at Mary Baker Eddy critically, and so it kind of disconnects people from using their rational thought and disarms them from being able to escape false traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I run into this frequently when I have a conversation, where it's what he's basically saying is what you hear often, which is, Alison, this is just totally the realm of faith. You're just overthinking this. You're just trying to find, you're looking for evidences. You're looking for things, and this just all boils down to faith. And I can completely accept and believe that there are definitely aspects about Mormonism, which that's true. It just completely will boil down to faith. But it's just that you can't lump it all into that, especially with a religion that is as young as this is and is based on some really critical truth claims that can be measured, studied, that we have records for. I just find that disingenuous to lump them all together like that.
Yeah, and occasionally you get like what happened in General Conference a few times ago, where they give you a paradox that cannot be resolved with faith. When they say, we have to accept a literal Adam and Eve because it is by that fall that the need for Christ's atonement came. And so basically, in order to accept Mormonism, you have to accept a literal Adam and Eve. And when you look at anthropology and just world history, it's impossible to reconcile those two notions.
Right.
Paul, are you still with us? Your picture's a little bit frozen there.
I'm listening very carefully.
Anything on this point about epistemology and separating metaphysical things from concrete things?
Well, he's opened up a traditional and huge area where he talks about the scientific worldview and Newtonianism and the Enlightenment, which could apply to all the other religions that believe in a supernatural order, that can never be proved. I'm not sure he's getting at the heart of what Mormons who are leaving the church are concerned about, because I think that's too broad. I think that's not, as I said before, I think the reason people are leaving the church, I think it could cope with the idea that some things you have to have faith in and some things you can prove, if they hadn't been deceived, if they didn't feel like they had been either there was non-disclosure when there should have been disclosure, or that there was a spin put on it when there shouldn't have been, or there was outright mendacity, because I think that's what is the most painful aspect of this. But even after you clear that up, you're still left with these imponderables, which I think are as imponderable in Mormonism as they are anywhere else, even though that we've been told that they aren't. They still are, in Mormonism, imponderable.
All right. Let's keep going and see where he goes.
I continued. One of the problems we have in Mormonism is that we've loaded too much into the truth cart. And then when anything in the cart starts to rot a bit or look unseemly upon further inspection, some have a tendency to overturn the entire cart or seek a refund for the whole lot. We've loaded so much into the truth cart largely because we've wanted to have the same kind of certainty about our religious claims, down to rather obscure doctrinal issues, as we do about scientific claims. Over the years, the church leadership and laity have also done our religion no favors by putting more in the cart than the cart could possibly bear. Many of the things which trouble people are things that we probably should never have been all that dogmatic about in the first place. I find that a little humility about our doctrine, especially given the contingencies of its historical development, goes a long way in remaining satisfied with the whole.
And I think this is a really great imagery that he's putting with the truth cart. I think it's a little bit hard for me when he first starts. One of the problems is we've loaded too much. Who is we that he's talking about? Who is the we?
Yeah.
I mean, he does mention leaders in the second paragraph of that, but it's not the members. It's not the members that have loaded the truth cart. It's the church itself that loaded it. The church itself created the truth cart and teaches it right from the start. I mean, we lead with the truth cart. Missionaries lead with it. From the time that you're in primary, you are taught foundational items that are in the truth cart, and it comes directly from the church. So if these two paragraphs are directed towards the actual prophet and leaders, then I totally support him on saying, okay, you've loaded too much into the truth cart. But he's a little ambiguous here about who it is he's talking about when he says we.
Yeah. I think he's articulating what you've been mentioning, Paul, which is that the church started out with a limited scope, and they've added so much into this that now it's unsustainable. And I agree, the imagery of the truth cart is good, because conceptually what he's saying is that there's all these things that we've accepted where if you deny any of them, you kind of have to just do away with the cart altogether. And he's calling for that just to be limited. Basically, let's pull back on what we're claiming absolute certainty about. And it seems to reflect what you're talking about, Paul. Would you agree with that?
I agree. I don't see it merely as pulling back. I see it also with correcting a great many theological errors in the church on a very few points. I mean, I think most of what people are concerned about just simply is dogmatic, and we shouldn't be involved in talking about those things. But the temple ceilings create lots of problems. That's easy to fix because we could just say, well, we'll seal everybody according to what they want, and it'll work out hereafter. It's easier
Seal
to
them
do
all
that.
and let God
But
sort
instead
them
of
out.
imposing a set of rules, temple rules, that just cause all kinds of grief for people, and instead of taking a position about the children of same-sex parents, don't take a position. Back off. We could have done that all along the line. But not only that needs to be done, there has to be a correction made in who it is we worship. I cannot defend the church's teachings, and I'm very loath to advance my own idiosyncratic belief structure that I've arrived at over many years. But I can tell you that for me, the foundational problem with the Mormon religion is that Christ is not God. There is a Heavenly Father above God. And that is not in the Book of Mormon. It's not in the New Testament.
Well, it's in the 1830 Book of Mormon.
Huh?
Well,
What?
in the 1830 Book of Mormon, isn't there something about? Well, I guess that it was saying Christ was the Lamb of God.
Yeah.
Or God was that
Yeah.
Christ was God. It had a kind of a Trinity view, right?
No. The Book of Mormon is emphatic that Christ is the eternal God manifesting himself to all nations. It says it in the frontispiece, which was not written by, it was supposed to be written by Moroni or somebody. And then in the 15th chapter of Mosiah, it lays out that God himself will come down and die for the people. Now, the reason why I think this is important is because if there is a God above Jesus who sends him to die, then you created a patriarchal structure that justifies the church sacrificing people because God sacrificed his son. You create a power structure that is extremely abusive. And in fact, the church has done that. It sacrifices its members for its image, for its purity. It believes in purity by exclusion. It excludes those who are going to contaminate the doctrine or the people, or that's what they believe. It's the apostles have turned themselves into the Sanhedrin. They are interested in making sure that everything is pure and kosher. It's nonsensical. And
so if you were going to identify your truth cart, and again, this is a personal thing because, like you said, that's just your personal view on things. But how far back would the church have to empty the truth cart? Like, what could they hold on to that you think would be sustainable?
I think there are 4 or 5 things that they have to go back to. They have to get rid of patriolatry, which is the idolatry of God the Father. It doesn't exist in our religion. Jesus is the Christ. He's the eternal God. He is the Father who reveals himself on earth as the Son. That's what the Book of Mormon teaches. The second thing is that there was no creation. Joseph Smith says that in his end of his life, last 5 years of his life, he gives these discourses, and he emphasizes that over and over again. There is no creation. We always existed. God always existed, and we always existed, except that we have to have all these experiences to develop. That's Mormon doctrine. The other doctrine is that the spiritual world and the physical world need to be on an equal footing. The body and the spirit body, or the intelligence, are not, one is not better than the other. They are both necessary. Just like male and female, just like, and people say, well, that's binarism. I say, well, not really, because the two binaries create everything. It's like everything exists between the North and South Pole. It's not like the North Pole and the South Pole are the only things that exist. The whole world exists between these two. It's just a way of talking. It's a metaphorical usage. But
so you see Mormonism as something that could hold on to certain key metaphysical truths.
Metaphysical truths, yes.
And still perpetuate. So, and it's interesting, you brought up the King Follett discourse in the Sermon on the Grove, which are those talks where he brings up those very unique things, which the church has almost abandoned now. And Patrick Mason will actually invoke some of those things. So it's very interesting that you said that. Let's keep going.
I continued. The CES letter, or formerly called the Letter to a CES Director, which he cited as one of the online sources that he had read. No doubt many of you are familiar with it. I said, the CES letter is emblematic of this all-or-nothing approach to religion. The letter is nearly a perfect inverse of the version of Mormonism it is reacting to. Jeremy Runnels may have written the letter, but it was actually an inevitability. Someone, sometime, somewhere was going to write that letter, because it was the obvious response to a certain style, tone, and mode of Mormonism that culminated in the highly doctrinaire, no retreat, no surrender positions taken by certain church leaders and members, especially in the second half of the 20th century. I would actually agree with the CES letter's basic notion that the Mormonism it is responding to is unsustainable. Where I disagree with the letter is that I don't think the Mormonism it is responding to is actually the real, only, or inevitable Mormonism. Certainly, that was some people's Mormonism, but it's not my Mormonism, and I don't think it's the Mormonism that is going to endure in future decades and centuries.
All right, this is one of the most remarkable paragraphs of his talk. Alison, what's your take on that?
Yeah, this paragraph is bold in the fact that he's giving this paragraph to FairMormon. I mean, it's amazing that he actually, basically he validated Jeremy Reynolds in writing the letter and saying, look, this was really inevitable that somebody was going to write this letter. Where I find it fascinating is that he talks about it being, inevitable for it to be written for this type of Mormonism, and that's again where I just find it really interesting. And he says, that's some people's Mormonism, but it's not mine. I just find that so fascinating because that the CES letter, that type of Mormonism, the way he phrases that, is the official Mormonism. So, that is what Mormonism has been all about. Those are the claims and the things that the official church itself has put in the truth cart. And so that's what's responded to in the CS letter. So I think it's marvelous if he says that's not his Mormonism, and that he doesn't think that that's the type of Mormonism that's going to endure in the future, decades and centuries. That's amazing. It's wonderful if it's not his Mormonism. It just happens to be the official Mormonism.
I get this all the time when you hear people like Bushman and now like Patrick Mason and Michael Ash and some of these defenders. They articulate a Mormonism that seems to be very different than what the brethren are saying, and so I feel like I've been gaslighted a little bit. I'm like, there are these issues, and they're like, no, those aren't really issues. You're fine. You can stay. You can do all these things. It's like, you don't get to declare what official Mormon. You're defending a Mormonism that exists in your imagination, with all of your thinking and your own personal idiosyncratic interpretation of things, but to the overwhelming majority of people that go to conference, that are under the thumb of very dogmatic bishops and stake presidents who are lapdogs to the general authorities, their Mormonism is much more rigid and much more exclusionary than this pie in the sky thing that you're articulating.
Right. I mean,
the
gaslighting term I think is very very accurate. A lot of times that is what it feels like. It feels in a sense that you want to say on the one hand, it's wonderful that you have the nuanced version of Mormonism, and it's much healthier. I actually like it a lot more. I wish that I would have had it, but if you're not even speaking in an official capacity for the church, just like Paul said, the church itself doesn't express these type of views. We don't hear this. We don't hear this from General Conference. We don't hear this from the prophet. We don't hear these types of claims from anybody other than Bushman, Givens, FairMormon. So it's really frustrating, actually.
Well, I'd like to speak up on this because I have a very idiosyncratic view of what real Mormonism is.
Wait, before you start, Paul, have you read the CES letter?
Yeah, I've read Jeremy Reynolds' letter, and I think it's a great letter. I have absolutely no problem. I think it's a long time coming. Somebody had the courage to be able to say to the brethren, you've created all of these problems. These are all problems that the 12 apostles have created over 150 years. Every one of them. And they will not take responsibility for it. They get to make all the decisions. Nobody else has any say-so in the church. They've correlated the church. They control every facet of everybody's life in the church. And then you can't ask them a question like, what was Joseph Smith doing marrying a 14-year-old? They won't answer it. I can answer it. My aunt was married when she was 15 years old to a 30-year-old man. And when I was 12 years old, I was listening to her talk to my mom about it. My mom, this is in 1957 or something, and she couldn't even say the word sex, my mom. So she said, well, Lena, how did you deal with the. And my Aunt Lena said, well, it was a surprise, but it was worth getting my own kitchen.
Okay, Paul,
now, the reason why I tell that story,
many of us, it's not the age disparity.
Because it's impossible to put ourselves in the minds of people that lived 180 years ago. It is a fiction that we can understand their motivations. We want to reduce Joseph Smith's motivations to one or two. There are multiple motivations that people have when they do things, and they are not pure, and some of them are pure, and it's mixed. And historians who write a history are constantly must simplify it. To get it into 100 pages or 800 pages, you've got to simplify and select, and we cannot get back into their minds. And so I get a little bit upset at people going after Joseph Smith. I'm not saying that he shouldn't be attacked. I'm just saying, how do you do it? But
okay, I'll tell you. You brought up a great example. Okay, so the way that people attack that is it's not the age disparity, just so that you kind of get the framework. You can go back and look at the letter written by Helen Mar Kimball herself, where she describes the events around that proposal. And then you look at it without having to judge, do presentism or anything like that, and you can say, well, here's a man claiming to be a man of God who, after she refused the initial proposal, he said, well, if you marry me, then your family is guaranteed salvation. Now, there is no theological doctrine, precedent, or something since then that would justify that type of statement, but it does work as a form of ecclesiastical abuse and manipulation in order to compel something that we could only see as, a religious charlatan getting away with something that would satisfy whatever inclinations he had.
Well, it would also be possible that a person who wasn't a religious charlatan, who was just horny, would do the same thing.
But he's using religious language, which makes him a religious charlatan, rather than just a non-religious charlatan.
If God can speak through Balaam's ass, he can speak through a very imperfect person.
Well, there are some people who would claim that precedent is not a legitimate lever to hang this on.
If I had been there, I would say, Joseph, what in God's name are you doing? Stop this, because this is all they're going to remember. They're not going to remember the stone in the hat. They're going to remember you doing this. Stop it, stop it, stop it. But it didn't. It got out of control.
But Paul,
the question we have to ask, if we believe in Mormonism, the people who believe, who are apologists, the question that they do not ask and they do not promulgate, that has to be answered, is what the hell was Jesus doing letting this go on? The question isn't why Joseph Smith was practicing polygamy, because I understand why he was practicing polygamy. He liked girls. But he could have had easy sex on the frontier. People are tripping over other people having sex on the frontier. And he's coming up with celestial marriage. And he makes some big, huge mistakes. But that isn't the question. If you're a believer that this church has any divine origin to it, the question that you've got to ask is, what is Jesus up to? Why is he founding a church on a stone and a hat? Why is he letting this guy do this stuff that's evidently going to come out later and cause this kind of suffering? And we never ask that question. That's the question that the apostles have to answer. They don't have to justify Joseph's actions. They could say, yeah, he did this stuff and we don't agree with it. But what was God up to? And that's always the question.
Well, that's a compelling question, but in my own transition, I went through this process because, it's not like everybody who investigates has this idea that prophets are completely perfect in all aspects of their lives, and then we just say, oh well, if he farted and didn't say excuse me, then he's done. It's not like that. We say, well, they're imperfect, but when they speak for God, then we can trust in that, and so
That's
they can
not
look at
true.
these complexities.
That's not true. Where does it say
No,
that?
no, but that's what the church is telling us that we.
That's what they say. It's not the church that tells us. It's the apostles that tell us that they are
The
infallible.
apostles today are no different from Joseph Smith back then. If you were to go to him and say, "Can we rely on what you're saying?" then he'd say, "Well, thus saith the Lord." It's not like when he's speaking in first person in the voice of Christ that we should say, "Well, that's just your opinion."
Well, the way it's supposed to happen is if it's thus saith the Lord, they're supposed to write it down. And then it's supposed to be presented to the church in conference, and everybody gets to read it, and they get to decide whether it becomes canonical scripture or not. And if Nemelka's lost book were presented to the church and everybody read it, it would probably not pass muster and never become part of the canon.
That's probably true.
The leaders of the church do not follow the rules. They lie all the time, and the main lie that they do is to say something in conference. They never say, "Thus saith the Lord." They never say, "This came by the Spirit." They never say, "The Lord appeared to us with his wounds all open and told us this." They never make anything clear, and they write it in the ensign, and the people are supposed to believe that it all has the same weight and validity, because they violate the revelations all the time. None of this stuff, the proclamation on the family, none of this would have been able to pass muster had it been placed before the membership and openly discussed. It would never have passed.
So it sounds like you agree with a lot of the objections that Jeremy Reynolds put in the CES letter, which he's alluding to here, with the exception maybe of some of the problems of the Book of Mormon that he talks about that are inherent to the text of the Book of Mormon itself. I think it's really validating that Patrick has basically, it's kind of we can no longer just demonize Jeremy Reynolds as FairMormon has done. I mean, for him to give this talk at the organization where they have just cast really intense ad hominem at him and his motivations and the way he did his thing, and for him to say, this is kind of an inevitability, I think allows Jeremy to space to be considered a person of integrity, because Patrick Mason is saying that a person of integrity could have responded to the Mormonism that, and he says that church leaders have established, and that's a legitimate response.
I think the questions raised by Jeremy Reynolds are all legitimate. I do not believe that Patrick Mason has the authority to rehabilitate Jeremy Reynolds. I think he can't rehabilitate Mike Quinn or me or Lavina Anderson or Margaret or Janice or any of us. He has no power to do that. If the president of the church were to stand up in conference and say that we were all really never excommunicated and that we should be listened to and shouldn't be stigmatized, even that would not redeem us, because it runs too deep now. People don't trust us. And I think Jeremy Reynolds, just by raising the question, disqualifies himself, because he's asking questions. He's asking really hard questions in a kind of nasty little way, which I applaud him for.
Well, that actually brings up a very good point. I hadn't thought about this. So what you're saying is that what has been done to your character and your standing in the community of your faith, your tribe, at the hands of the church who's demonized you for asking honest questions, just like Jeremy Reynolds asked honest questions, that cannot be redeemed with a talk like this.
Absolutely not. The stake presidents are going to continue to grill people in their in the temple interviews. They're going to continue to follow the policy that the gays, and the LGBTQ community is going to continue to suffer. And Noel Reynolds and Fiona Gibbons and Terrell Gibbons and the Bushmans, they're not going to be able to redeem anybody, because the condemnation doesn't really come from them. The condemnation comes from Boyd Packer and Dallin Oaks and Russell Nelson and these guys who are no more they're real estate agents. They believe in real estate.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Are they speaking for the Lord? I don't know why people can't just use common sense. I mean, they stand up there, let's go shopping. For heaven's sake, we went from the kingdom of God or nothing to let's go shopping. if that doesn't give you a narrative arc of where Mormonism is, I don't think anything can.
Well, in the mindset of the true believer, you make allowances. You find ways to elevate those very mundane and revealing aspects of the leader's activities. But I think
if you're reading the 23rd chapter of Matthew and you realize, gee, who is it that Jesus is talking about here? He's talking about Dallin Oaks. He's
whited
talking about this
sepulchre.
unregenerated frat boy who managed to worm his way up into the Council of the 12. I don't know how we can't see that. He's a lawyer. He will do anything for his client. He'll say anything. What's going to happen if he becomes president? If he becomes president, he won't know how to act like a client because he's always been its lawyer. It's plain as day to me. I mean, if you read the 23rd chapter of Matthew, Jesus is saying they don't go into heaven themselves and they don't let anybody else in. They're whited sepulchres. I mean, you have...
Keepers at the gate. Spoken like a true lawyer. Thank you for that honesty and insight.
I'm sorry, I'm yelling because this gets me so... I mean, to me it's so obvious, and yet it's not obvious, I suppose.
I know. It's when you're in that system of belief, it's not obvious. Anyway, so anything else about this section where he briefly alludes to the CES letter, Alison?
Oh, I'm just fascinated to see actually kind of just what happens in the future with this, because there has been, you know, it's been very a lot of acrimony between, you know, FairMormon and Jeremy, and so it'll just be very interesting.
Right, and Patrick says, you know, that's not his Mormonism. So, you know, what does it take to get Patrick Mason's Mormonism into the hearts and minds of the people who actually have control over what Mormonism is?
And you know, up until now, you know, he's prefaced, he's kind of, to me, as I read it and listened to his talk, this was kind of the build up, and now we're kind of at the crescendo of his talk. He's built up, and now he's basically said, okay, so the CES letter addresses this Mormonism that is filled with this truth cart, and it's filled with these things that are in the truth cart that really are unsustainable. And if Mormonism is going to endure, it's going to have to be a different kind of Mormonism. And now really the rest of the talk, he describes his version of Mormonism. If he could design Mormonism, these would be the things that, and so I think that the talk now turns at this point, and that's what we see the rest of the talk.
All right, well, let's see what that pivot goes to.
One of the key tasks before us is, and this is still part of my response to him, one of the key tasks before us is developing a better, more sophisticated, and frankly more Christian theology of prophets and prophethood. We have treated our prophets too often as demigods. We do not believe in prophetic infallibility. This cannot be said enough, and it cannot be taken seriously enough. We give it lip service, but too often do not believe it, nor consider its implications other than the intellectually lazy conclusion that the whole thing must either be all true or a complete fraud. We need to think harder about why we should sustain prophets and apostles whom we know will occasionally be wrong about certain things. We don't always know what those things are except in hindsight, because we were usually all wrong together. We still have a lot of work to do.
I want to point out that he's depicting, he's kind of using the academic pulpit to talk about things in a way that is disconnected from the reality of people living in real time in relation to the prophets and apostles. It's all fine and good to stand on a pulpit and say, well, prophets and apostles are going to get things wrong sometimes. But the way that we actually live it is they're hitting us in the face with wrong things. And if we stand up and say that's wrong, we are penalized for it. We are cast out. We are ostracized. We're given church discipline. Like Paul, we're kicked out altogether. And the only answer that they have for us is you can believe whatever you want. You just can't talk about it. You can't share it. You can't openly communicate about it. And that's not freedom. That's not, you know, that's not a free agency that is born out of people looking at all sides of things and then coming to a realistic conclusion.
Well, and I also found it really interesting. I mean, if I was in the church and I heard the first part where he said, you know, we've treated our prophets too often as demigods. We don't believe in prophetic fallibility. This cannot be said enough. We cannot be taken seriously enough. We give lip service to it. Absolutely, completely on board with what he's saying right there. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But then he pivots from there and says something that's just really weird when he says, we need to think harder about why we should sustain prophets and apostles whom we know will occasionally be wrong about certain things. It's like, wait a minute, but you've just said we don't believe in prophetic infallibility as a church. That's not what they teach. We give lip service to it, but it's not. And now immediately he pivots and says, but we need to think harder on why we should sustain prophets and apostles whom we know. Do you see?
Right. See, part of the problem is I think he's redefining what sustain is. I think because some people they partition sustain and they say, well, if I sustain him, that means that I'm rooting for him. Hey, get the thing right. But what it actually means, when they say follow the prophet, when we sing follow the prophet, when we talk about this notion of following the prophet, what that fundamentally means is that if I have an opinion about something that is different from the prophet, then I need to sacrifice my personal opinion and trust and follow the prophet. Right. Because he's been endowed with this special spiritual gift. He knows he has a greater view of things. He's closer to the mind of God than I am, and so I need to defer my conscience. I need to defer my judgment because he'll probably be proven right in the long term.
Right.
Well, that hasn't historically happened. What's happened historically is that they've been on the wrong side of every social justice issue since the 19th century. And I can tell you something else. They're not asking us to do what you described it, subordinate your judgment to theirs. They do that in the 12. The junior members of the 12 have to subordinate their judgment to the senior members. And the senior members have to subordinate their judgment to the most senior members. They take 2 votes. They discuss things openly, and then they take a vote. And they realize they don't agree on anything, which they never do. And then they take a second vote in which the juniors all basically subordinate their judgment to the seniors. That's how they run the church. It's a Soviet-style management from top to bottom. I'm surprised they don't stand on some kind of a wall on May Day and wave to the the nuclear missiles being paraded in front of them. It's pure Soviet-style management. And
so it sounds like, now, hold on, Paul, before you demonize this and put this at the feet of the apostles, are you paying attention to the Council of 50? Because those minutes are coming out, and when you look at how Joseph Smith set up the Council of 50, every vote, nothing passes unless it's unanimous. And when you go down the line for the vote...
That's the beauty of unanimity, has to be tied to the fact that the Quorum of the 12 was never intended to run the church. They were intended to be a traveling missionary body. They had jurisdiction over all areas of the world where the church hadn't been organized. At the trial of Sidney Rigdon, when Brigham Young stood in the pulpit and argued for the preeminence of the Council of the 12, he never based it on the Section 107 because he knew that that didn't work. He based it on the fact that they all had their second anointings. And then he also said, and there are others, not of the 12, who have their second anointings. Those are the ones who get to run the church. And he was taking a big risk because he did not have seniority in the quorum of the anointed. William Marks did. William Marks had been anointed directly under the hand of Joseph Smith, and Brigham Young had not. And when the reorganized church was finally organized, the Canal Community of Christ, it was done by people who had received their anointing by Joseph Smith, including Emma. So we don't understand church history very well because all of these things are kind of hidden from view. But the fact of the matter is that the Quorum of the 12 now took over. And their unanimity issue had to do with how they managed the mission field, not how the first presidency is supposed to manage the church. The management of the church is completely a mess because there's too many people trying to manage it at once. And as soon as the President Monson, which is who he's practically non-compos mentis now, there's an apostolic interregnum where the 2 counselors and the 12 members and Tom shows up.
I'm starting to think that you don't sustain the prophets and apostles.
Well, what do you mean by that? They don't sustain me. I love them as much as they love me. It's mutual.
Okay, I don't want to get too far off track.
Well, we're not off track.
That sounds like an area of history that's going to be very compelling to look at, the trial of Sidney Rigdon, because it sounds like it's going to reveal a lot about the politics of the early
politics of the early church. It's all laid out in the trial of Sidney Rigdon. People can get it online. It's a wonderful piece of work. But the issue that Patrick Mason is raising here, he's talking about the fact that
he's saying that we've got to sustain them, even though they're
the leaders of the church are de facto infallible. De jure, they say they're not. They say we're not infallible, but if you get into an argument with them, they always win. So that's de facto infallibility. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And I actually got into an extended online debate discussion with a BYU professor talking about epistemology, and he was saying that you have to look for the answer inside yourself, and you don't just trust on the general authorities. And so I told him, okay, just give me one example of something where you prayed about it, you came to your own conclusion that was different on a key issue than a general authority, and he couldn't. De facto infallibility. All right.
And I concluded, I said, I sincerely hope you can find a way to stay with and in and for the church, because we need people like you. As you can see, I don't think that we can just blame the doubters for not believing enough. Indeed, in some cases, they were set up by being asked to believe too much. Either in the absence of actual data or in doctrinal propositions or theological frameworks that could not stand the test of time, let alone a basic smell test. Take two examples from my own mission. First, I repeatedly and passionately bore testimony as a 19-year-old that as a young man, Joseph Smith was absolutely not engaged in treasure seeking or money digging. I can't tell you how many people I told that. Second, I read and discussed with other missionaries various talks by general authorities teaching that blacks were fence-sitters or otherwise less valiant in the pre-existence, which explained why they were cursed in mortality. In the first case, the Joseph Smith money digging, I certainly didn't intend to lie to anyone, but that's precisely what I did because I hadn't been taught any better. The second case, about blacks, is more pernicious to me, with moral and ethical implications that make me shudder as I look back. But as missionaries, we were simply doing what the rest of the church and its leaders had been doing for about a century and a half, filling in theological and historical blanks with what were really some rather reprehensibly bad explanations, because we felt like we had to have a solid doctrinal basis for everything, even if we were making it up. And if a general authority said it, well, then it must be dictated straight from heaven. I've had to repent for my...
We can pause here for a second. Do you have a comment there?
I can tell you, we didn't. On the day the priesthood was given to the blacks in June of 1978, I was in law school. Everybody was cheering about that change.
Yeah.
And the only reason why it didn't happen sooner was because Harold B. Lee was a racist, and what's his name? The other one that was down in the Arizona Apostle, I forget. He used to write in the church news all the time.
Huh? Delbert Stapley?
Stapley. Delbert Stapley, not Delbert Stapley. Marky Peterson. Marky Peterson was down visiting in South America, and Spencer Kimball decided this is a good time for me to bring this up because he's out of town. And they prayed and they changed it.
Well, I think the thing that you said where there were people cheering it, that means that the entire, everybody that was cheering had already known in their hearts that it was wrong.
Yeah.
And so finally they're given permission to let what is in their heart be expressed openly so that they're not penalized for it.
Yeah, who are the people, though, that didn't believe?
Well, they left. I ain't going to be in no church that's going to allow blacks to have the priesthood.
Do we know how many people left the church because the blacks got the priesthood? I think nobody. I think the people that were upset was Mark Peterson, Harold B. Lee was dead, and those are the people that were upset because they are the ones who believed that they had to follow Brigham Young.
I will tell you, my mom told me about her experience, and she said there were people who, when they heard about that, they got up and left.
Well,
and maybe they joined the FLDS, because I hear that they still carry that notion.
oh boy, do they? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think if anyone who's watching this, if you haven't had a chance to read the Stuart Udall sequence, it's a series of 6 different articles that document a pretty remarkable person who was born and raised in a Mormon family and eventually rose to prominence in government, and one of JFK's cabinet members, who actually had some interaction with the prophets on the issue of race. And this is in the 1960s, a couple of decades before the change, and he was talking to them about these principles way before then. And I think they weren't alone. There was a Mormon underground who were all sharing these ideas. The brethren were the ones keeping the church in the shadows in terms of race relations and universal brotherhood. And so when he talks about there being serious moral and ethical considerations in acknowledging that they were teaching racist things in General Conference, I'm right there with him. And unfortunately, the implication that you can't avoid is that these men have no greater connection to God, no more spiritual insight than my uncle, than my neighbor, and they have less spiritual insight than the Presbyterians and the other people who had come to the terms with universal brotherhood and racial equality before the Mormons, generations before the Mormons. And so when we say we sustain the prophets, in effect, it means that people who do that surrender their conscience to the prophets, and they are not worthy of that. The most compelling thing that you can see to make this case is in that Stuart Udall sequence. When Stuart Udall wrote a national letter decrying the Mormon doctrine, he received like 100 letters from faithful Mormons who all criticized him from his position, and he saved every one of those letters, and they're kept in his archives. And I've scanned them in so that you can read them, so you have a snapshot of what the heart of Mormonism is, and that heart was dictated by what the apostles taught. And this is true because then 2 apostles wrote Stuart Udall, and they chastised him as well, and they reflected the exact same sentiments as the members of the church did. And so
and I would say that this is I don't want to use the word blame, seems like a very loaded word, but the responsibility that the members, why do the members do that? The members do that because the church has taught them that that's what they're supposed to do. Yeah. So we're taught from the time that we're primary kids that you trust and obey and believe the prophet. And so that's instilled in members. And so if it feels uncomfortable, you put it away. You push it to the side, and you decide that later on you're going to understand it, or if the prophet got it wrong, that God will make it right somehow at some point. I mean, those are all things that you're told and taught. And so you make it work. You make it work, and
your point about moral accountability, I think, is good, and that is that even though you've been taught these things and you've been raised in these things, you are the personal agent in acting these things. And so if you're going to speak with hatred, with animosity, because you've been given permission to, because of the racist things that have been told to you by the prophet, you're the one ultimately accountable for those things. The Stanley Milgram experiments, where a person was told to shock someone if they got things wrong and they increased the voltage, are very enlightening in this concept. And what Milgram came up to say is he declared that there was this thing called the agentic state, where people shift agency and accountability for what they're doing to the authority figure, and so they continue to perpetuate those things that they wouldn't normally do of their own free will, because they've been told to by an authority figure. And so we saw this in the Nuremberg trials, where they tried to say I was just following orders, and it's not a defensible moral position. So it sounds like he had to come to terms with some of that as he reflected on the moral and ethical implications of the things that he repeated because he read them in General Conference. So let's keep going.
On unchristian words and acts, and have been able to reconcile myself to the fact that the church that sent me out as an official representative didn't arm me with better and more accurate information. However,
it's not just that they didn't arm him with better and more accurate information. They armed him with false information and a narrative that he had to follow his leaders without any real agency.
Many people have not been able to make the same peace. They feel that they were betrayed or set up by the very institution that had taught them to be honest and true in all things. Part of our baptismal covenant is to mourn with those who mourn is to try to understand empathetically and charitably what those with sincere doubts and questions are going through. Most people who become disaffected from the church, many of whom are returned missionaries, endowed in the temple, and have served faithfully in major callings in their wards and states. Most of them fall into one of two very broad and overlapping categories that I discuss in my book. What Richard Bushman refers to as those who feel either switched off or squeezed out. The switched off group includes those who encounter troubling information online or somewhere else, usually regarding our history and doctrine. This new knowledge doesn't square with what they've previously learned in all their years in the church, sometimes by way of direct contradiction, but usually by revealing parts of the story that we typically don't share or talk about in our 3-hour block on Sundays. There's a standard list of problematic subjects, most of which are now discussed at length in the Gospel Topics essays on LDS.org.
Which are hidden, inaccessible, not really discussed.
Which for a half century have been the subject of intelligent analysis, rigorous analysis, in print sources like Dialogue, the Journal of Mormon History, and numerous academic books.
Well, this is very disingenuous because
Yes.
the put Sunstone off limits. Back in those days, before 1991, people from CES, from RICS, as it was known then, and BYU and Hawaii, professors would come to Sunstone. We hashed it out. We had a big argument back then about whether Mormonism was neo-Orthodox, and I was involved in the grace arguments now that seem like they're old hat versus works. They didn't allow people to go to that. They stopped that, and they made that off limits. And even though I think Dallin Oaks worked with Gene England to put together Dialogue back in the 60s, he about being beware of alternate voices. He was the one who used that term for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
In order to shut down any alternate sound. They made us all, they stigmatized. The reason why we were excommunicated, all of us in September, all 6 of us in September of 1993, was because they wanted to stigmatize us. Because they didn't want our voices heard.
By excommunicating you, they would kill your message.
Yep.
They would kill any alternative view. We were not against the church. We were not saying it wasn't true. We weren't attacking the truth. I never said, when I talked to Dallin Oaks once, this was back in 1982 or 83, I said, Dallin, it's not that I believe that you're false apostles. I just think you're the worst apostles in the history of Christianity. You never teach the gospel. You don't talk about love. You're always talking about works and writing in your journal and paying your tithing. You've created this long list of things that people have to do to get to the temple. You're creating a legalistic religion that's smothering people.
So you're saying basically that he's misrepresenting the nature of that type of research. He's making it sound like the church has been supportive of everybody who's been exploring these things, and you, having lived it, are saying it wasn't that way. The church was actually antagonistic towards those of us who were looking into things which don't necessarily fit the mold they set.
It was brutally hostile, and it engaged in a serious brand of spiritual abuse.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
But most people are not consulting the peer-reviewed scholarship. And far too many church members are still unaware that the Gospel Topics essays even exist. In recent years, many thousands have found their way to the previously mentioned Letter to a CES Director, a slick, but in my opinion, intellectually amateurish document that has midwifed countless people out of the church.
Intellectually amateurish document. Is that how you found it, Paul, when you read the CES letter?
No, I don't think Jeremy Runnels is an academic. I think he's a person who has these legitimate questions, and they really are legitimate. I mean, I don't think that all of them are phrased the way I would, but it's perfectly clear that he has these very legitimate questions, and I think they should have been answered a long time ago.
Oh, and by using this language here, Patrick's kind of contributing to the whole, basically disarming the effectiveness of the CES letter, discrediting it by labeling it as intellectually amateurish.
And slick.
Yeah, and slick, and all of these key words.
Well, is there an
But-
elitist group that exists in the church? I'll tell you what happened. In 1992, I formed the Mormon Alliance on July 4th with some other people. There were 12 or 15 of us, I can't remember, that worked on a letter that we drafted after spending about 8 weeks in meeting after meeting, getting the wording just right, which we sent to the leaders of the church, where we pointed out it was very well written. We had a lot of credentials. We weren't amateurish by any means. We sent it to them. No response.
Are you talking about that asked similar questions to what are raised in the CES letter?
Yes, it was. The letter, I wrote a memoir called Road to Exile, which is available on Amazon if anybody wanted to read it, or they can get it. And in the appendix, I put that letter that we sent to the general authorities. Their response was, a year later, they excommunicated 6 of us all in 1 month.
So you're saying that whether or not it was academic or slick or whatever doesn't matter, because you guys sent something that had all of the academic gravitas and credentials that were needed.
And they didn't pay any attention. When ordained women came about a couple of years ago, and I said, Kate, they're going to excommunicate you. She said, no, that won't happen. I said that before. And they said, because it's changed. It has not changed. It doesn't matter how amateur you are, how many credentials you have. This man, Patrick Mason, is cruising for a bruising. Now, they won't excommunicate him because he's an academic, but he will get called in, and he will be he won't come out of the smoking room the same toad that he went in, to quote Wind in the Willows.
Well, okay, well, all right. Well, let's continue and see what he has to say.
Unfortunately, for many who land there, the letter is the culmination of their quest for knowledge, rather than being just one data point among many.
Okay, the letter is not one data point. It is a central focus that throws you out into all different data points. I mean, he references where he gets things, and that's where you go and you look at those different things.
Right.
And,
well, and that just irritates me to no end, as if there are no footnotes and there are no links and there are no primary sources that you can go to. It's exactly the same as reading a lot of other things that FairMormon does when they reference things and link things. I mean, yeah, that's
would he demonize people who just went to FairMormon and stopped there?
Right.
And that was the culmination of their quest for knowledge?
Right.
All right, let's keep going.
In any case, once they discover these new facts and realize they're not just the inventions of malicious anti-Mormon propaganda, many people start to wonder what else they haven't been told.
Once they learn that they had been lied to, then they wonder, what else are they lying to me about? But no, it's not a lie. They just, it wasn't it's a lie. It's by this. If you hold us to the same standards, if you hold the church to the same standards that they hold us, then it's a lie. If the bishop says, have you drunken beer, and you just fail to mention that because it's not pertinent, then it's a lie. All right.
We begin to see duplicity rather than sincerity in the church's presentation of its doctrine and history. Skepticism and doubt begin to overcome trust and faith.
Those skepticism and doubt in the face of perfidy and deception is a healthy, self-preserving response.
One of the ironies we haven't fully appreciated in our discussions of doubt is that to some degree our church culture is responsible for many people's reactions to troubling information. Whether consciously or not, they are often simply applying what they learned in well-intentioned but ultimately damaging primary and youth lessons, such as when the teacher offers the class a bowl of ice cream, then dumps a small amount of dirt on it and asks if anybody wants it now. Of course, they all say no, and the teacher points out that this is what just a little bit of sin does. It ruins everything. So those who see just a little bit of dirt in church history are acting in ways that seem entirely commensurate with what they've been taught their whole lives. God cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance, so we turn away from sin and touch not the unclean thing. Unable to manage the cognitive dissonance, these people's relationship to the church, which they realize has a little bit of dirt sprinkled on top, becomes tenuous, and it often breaks. Many people feel they can't participate with integrity in church meetings where certain details are either neglected, covered up, or denied. In short, they've become switched off. Some of these people not only leave the church, but also abandon Christianity and even theism, since God, Jesus, and Mormonism had always come as a package deal in their minds.
I want to point out in the transcript that he provided to FairMormon, he left out the part about the church being ice cream with a little bit of dirt sprinkled on top. That was perhaps a little bit too revealing of something with the dirt on the top. Anyway,
That's interesting.
Anything about that paragraph, Alison?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I found really interesting about that is the way he phrases it. He talks about, you know, he says Mormon culture, but again, it's almost as if he separates the culture and people's reactions and people's literalness in their belief and what they've put in the truth cart from the actual church itself. Mormon culture comes as a result of what they taught.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think he does draw the connections. He just doesn't say it blatantly. I mean, he says they're primary lessons that set the tone. And who makes the primary lesson manuals? Well, there's committees in the church. Who selects those committees and gets approved? Well, there's the correlation committee, and those things, it all goes back to church authority. And so, you know, the church authorities are the ones who establish the culture through how they're taught and what is reinforced. And you can't just blame the members because it's sanctioned.
Right. But what I find interesting is his word choice, the way he phrases it. He kind of dances around it, and sometimes you get the impression and feeling that it's the members that keep doing this. It's the members that keep choosing this or believe this way or whatever. And there's this, I don't know, it's a little discomforting to me over and over again the way he phrases and words it rather than specifically saying the reason why the members believe the way they do is because they were taught that.
Yeah. All right. Anything on that, Paul?
No, I mean, it's obvious, and I'm glad you're seeing what I see, and that they are always trying to deflect this from the guys who are responsible.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I think one of the concepts he brings up there is that the church prepares people to reject it. I think for me, the church taught me very much that integrity and honesty are important things. And so when I started to see that they were absent in how the church has dealt with its troubling issues, it wasn't just that the fact that they lied, but that was a big thing. And then it led me to go on to see what they lied about and how it was covered up. And more issues came every time I would dig. And so ultimately, the church does teach some good, strong moral principles, but they tend to get the church in trouble once you turn them back on to the church and start looking at them at the same lens they teach you to look at outsiders as.
May I make this statement about the Catholic Church? The Catholic Church, excuse me.
Go ahead.
The Catholic Church had this big sex scandal, and people got very angry in the Catholic Church, and the Vatican got involved, and Bernard Law was thrown out in Boston, but people kept going to church. There wasn't a big exodus of Catholics. There was a lot of anger, and there was some exodus, but very little compared to what we're experiencing proportionally. And I think that we have to analyze why this is. Because when Catholics go to church and the host is elevated, and the moment of the hypostasis of Christ in their minds happens in the host, they connect directly to that experience, and they take Christ in the Eucharist. We don't have that, even though we have the sacrament. What we do is we transfer that same religious feeling to our leaders. The Catholics transfer that religious feeling to the host. And even though the Catholic Church openly claims to have an intercessory priesthood, it's only intercessory in the sense that the priest elevates the host. But the priest doesn't really stand between the person and God, because the person takes the communion directly into them.
Does
But
the priest control who can take communion?
Yeah, that's true, a little bit, but not much, because you can just do it if you want to. You don't have to go to confession. But I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying there's this transference that happens in the ritual, whereas our ritual is obedience to the leaders.
Yeah.
Because
I tried to explain this to my brother. When you talked about the chapter in Matthew, I tried to explain to him that the fact that you have to sit in front of a bishop and a stake president and be deemed worthy to go commune with God in the temple is the very embodiment of people who sit at the gate and prevent people from going in.
That's exactly right. The Catholics go to confession. They say, I confess. They get absolution. They take the host, but it's direct. And even though the Catholics claim to have an intercessory priesthood, and we claim not to, in fact, their intercessory priesthood is less intercessory than our alleged non-intercessory priesthood, because we really do block the people's way.
Yeah. All right, let's get through his characterization of switched off and squeezed out, and then we'll probably stop it there for tonight because it's a little bit long, and we can finish it out and perhaps tomorrow if you guys have availability. All right, so
group in Richard Bushman's perceptive typology are those who feel squeezed out, like they just don't fit in at church. Usually this comes about more because of current issues than past ones, although historical and doctrinal concerns may be contributing factors. Oftentimes those who feel squeezed out fully embrace the basic principles and ordinances of the gospel, but they feel alienated over things like the dominant, the dominant and unreflexive political conservatism among most American church members, or heartfelt questions about whether girls and women have all the opportunities for spiritual growth and recognition in the church that boys and men do, or how the church fails to adequately minister to and often hurts our LGBT brothers and sisters. Feeling isolated, alienated, judged, and sometimes pressured, these saints sense that there's simply no place for them in the church in spite of their core beliefs. They feel squeezed out, and many of them leave us. Of course, these two categories, switched off and squeezed out, they grossly oversimplify the complex reasons why people choose to withdraw or leave from the church. Every person's story is as unique as they are. It's impossible for a book, a general conference address, or even scripture to minister to people one by one as Jesus did. So that's where each of us comes in. As we saw from the show of hands earlier, doubt and disaffection are manifested somewhere in virtually all of our families, wards, and social networks. So even if doubt is a stranger to your own heart, through your relationships with others, the challenge of faith crisis, as it's often called, is just as important to you as if you were going through it yourself.
All right, that's a good pausing point. He gets into how to respond to that in the next section of his talk, and then he actually identifies some issues that he thinks as a church should be addressed. So let's go ahead and pause it there. Any comments on that last section about people who are squeezed out?
No, I mean, I actually think the terms the switched off and the squeezed out, what he explained and described there is really, they're really good. Yeah. He does a pretty good job of covering a broad range of reasons why people feel like it's not a good fit for them anymore.
The only thing I would add is that there really is a squeezing that takes place, because it's obvious that even though I lay the problems at the feet of the apostles, it's not the apostles that squeeze you out. In my case, it was true, but generally speaking, right. It's the true believing, most literalistic members with the most certainty and sometimes the cruelty and intolerance that they get from the leaders. Somehow they get that mindset that they squeeze people out in the wards and stakes. And it really is a checkered proposition, because when I was excommunicated, Kerry Hines was my stake president, and he was an old friend of Boyd Packer, and they colluded. But I was told by Richard Hinckley, who was the son of Gordon B. Hinckley, was a stake president at the time, and I got word back from that they met, and he said if Paul and Margaret had been in our stake, they would never have even brought up for charges, because they were not intimidated by Boyd P. Packer. So it has to do with who your stake leaders and your ward leaders are. They could do a lot of the squeezing but if you're in a liberal area, you won't be touched. It's very interesting that it's checkerboard.
Yeah, it may be that Patrick Mason benefits from that as well because of the seat that he holds.
Right.
You know, I think he's in a sense is free to say some of these things because he's in the Howard W. Hunter Chair at the Claremont University, where you know, you're supposed to have the academic freedom to say certain things. It's interesting to me that he's articulating a new approach to dealing with these faith crises. FairMormon has very much taken it in terms of we're going to answer these questions on a factual basis. We're going to prove to them that there's a righteous paradigm for polygamy. We're going to, you know, refute the notions of prophets being racist. And instead, he's saying that we need to start to give pastoral care to people in faith crisis. And what I perceive that means is let's find ways to think about these things where the truth doesn't matter, where we can look for metaphor, we can look for spiritual meaning, we can look for things like that that will allow people to stay in the church. And I think if you're just going to stay in the church for the social benefits of it, that's one thing. But if you're going to continue to defer your personal judgment to prophets and stay in obedience, and then that goes on down to stake presidents and bishops, if you're going to just automatically defer to their authority because they claim to have a mantle over you, that becomes problematic as soon as you lose the notion that they have any special abilities in that regard, because they're going to have some policy that goes against your conscience and you're going to speak up about it. And ultimately you get squeezed out because you're trying to stay, but you're trying to also be authentic. Right. And you start to push against the boundaries that you have to push against if you're not simply towing the line. And that's where, like you mentioned, Paul, you know, people thinking that they have the truth already will start to squeeze you out. So thank you guys for going through this first part of the talk, and hopefully we'll be able to find another time in the next day or so to finish it out. I'm sorry we couldn't get it through all tonight, but it's getting late, and I know these things get long anyway. It's always intriguing to talk about them. So we'll sign off now.
Okay.
Good night.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.